What's up guys? This is Evan with Backwoods Adventure Mods. Today we're going to install our 2020 Transit Nomad Series front bumper. So a couple changes from the previous version. We've updated the front outer shell to a one-piece design instead of a three-piece design, and that's given us superior strength and a simpler install. It's still the same hybrid design as the rest of our Nomad bumpers, where the outer shell is aluminum and the winch cradle and recovery points are steel. And today we're going to install it on a 2021 all-wheel drive. This product works on the all-wheel drive, two-wheel drive, with or without any of the sensors. So when you open the box, you'll get the aluminum outer shell of the bumper, the steel winch cradle, and all the mounting hardware. We use all grade 8 hardware except where it needs to be stainless. You'll get a delete if you don't have the active cruise control sensor. If you do, we have a bracket and plastic cover for that. If you don't have parking sensors, we have a little machined set of deletes. It goes in the hole and gives you a clean look like you do have the sensors. If you do, we have our own CAD designed parking sensor housing that snaps in, and then you'll be able to snap your sensor into that. To do the install, you'll need a basic set of hand tools, sockets, wrenches, a few Torx bits, and a trim removal tool, as well as some type of tool to cut the fender flare and a drill or grinder to help you remove the OEM bumper that's spot welded in place. Okay, so for this install, we want to keep the upper part of the fascia, but remove the bumper. Right now it's all one piece. We have to take it apart to unclip. So the first step is to cut the fender flare where the desired line needs to be, which is really just a continuation of this line. In my opinion, it's best just to use a straight edge and sight line it. I don't have a professional straight edge with me today, so I've got this cardboard box that's going to work just fine. You do have the option to take this off and cut it on a table. But what I've found is when you take this off, you have a pretty good chance of breaking the little clips that are behind here. So I think it's better to cut it on the van. My preferred tool is one of these. It makes a lot less mess, it's cleaner, it's harder to mess up. You can use a die grinder with a cutoff wheel or a cutoff wheel on an angle grinder. If that's all you have, it's fine, just be very careful. Or worst case scenario, you can score it multiple times with a razor blade. I just finished cutting both sides, and now we're going to take off the rest of the fascia. Most of it's going to be done with a trim tool for the little plastic clips and a 10mm socket. And for the underside, there's one spot where you will want a pretty long extension. There's quite a few more of these on the underside as well. Just in front of the front tire, you'll see a hole, and there's a bolt way up in there. After you take out all those 10mm headed bolts, there's a couple bolts here with a 13mm head. Sometimes there's a license plate frame over this and it's riveted on, and you'll need to drill the rivets out. I think it's a 3/16 drill bit. Okay, I forgot one. There's one sneaky little 10mm bolt hiding right in here that you access directly from the inside. Okay, these can be very tricky. As you can see, I actually broke the middle one. If you can wedge something in here to push the existing clip back a little bit, that'll help. Just be careful not to scratch your paint. Lastly, there are a couple big clips on each side, hidden kind of under the headlight and under the top section here. That is being clipped in by this big square hole, basically, so we have to pry up on that, and then there's one on the other side and also one near each headlight. Yeah, that's it right there where I'm pointing, so I'm going to pop that one loose. Make sure to check for any wires that need to be disconnected before you try to take it off. And since we have the active cruise control, we have a few wires. Okay, so unless you have fog lights or parking sensors, there actually aren't any wires to unplug. That one could have waited. With the fascia off, now we need to separate the upper fascia, the grille, from the plastic bumper cover. So there's 2 screws, one on each end. It's an 8mm socket. And then we're gonna use the trim tool and just some force and awkwardness to remove these clips. Okay, now that we've separated the front fascia from the bumper, we're going to continue to remove the rest of the splash shields, and we'll get any of these wiring harnesses out of our way. It's just more 10mm socket and trim tool. If your van's equipped with the electronic louvers, we're going to take those out as well. It's an 8mm socket. There's 4 on the top, 1 on the bottom, and a wiring plug. Okay, we're getting the top 4 bolts out and the wiring plug. It's down in this hole. And now I'm going to grab the 2 on the bottom. Okay, it's clipped on the bottom as well, so you'll have to unclip it and push it rearwards before you can bring it up and out. Next, we're going to take out the sensor for the active cruise control. There are 2 bolts on the bottom that are 8mm. It's a jumbo van. The screw on top is a T25 Torx. They've got a couple little rubber push pins in there for safety. Be careful not to hit this or drop it. It's pretty sensitive. All right, now with all the plastic and all the electronics out of our way, it's time to take off the factory crash bars, bumpers, whatever you want to call them. We're going to take the bottom one off first because it's the easy one. And then the top one, it's not quite as simple because Ford actually chose not only to use 8 bolts, 4 per side, but also spot welds, 2 per side. So we're just going to go ahead and get all the bolts out of the way. We can take all the bolts out of this, but it won't go anywhere. Recommend that you use an impact wherever you can, and then however you have to do it on the others. I really like on these inside ones to use a ratcheting wrench. I left mine at the shop today, so I'm going to be using a mix of different extensions. All right, 8 more bolts on this side, and just to note, I left one of the bolts in on the lower piece just so it doesn't fall on the other side. I'm just going to temporarily unplug this so I don't damage it with my socket wrench. Don't forget to plug it back in or you won't have any air conditioning. This is the bolt I left in on the first side to keep it from falling on me. On a side note, this van already has a Van Compass a Van Compass Topo lift installed, which has no effect on the bumper fitment. Okay, the lower crash bar is off and the bolts are out of the bumper, crash bar, whatever you want to call this upper piece. For some reason, Ford decided to add a pinch weld in 2 spots on each frame rail, here, and the same on the other side. There's several different ways you can get through this. You can choose to drill them out. If you do that, you're going to have to drill through this outer piece first, and then use a really long drill bit and drill through the back. I've heard some people say they'll use a plasma cutter and just cut this off here so they can just drill one time. The way I recommend is to use a chisel to wedge in between these, bend it out a little bit, and then you can get a Sawzall blade and cut through the spot weld. And that's what we're going to do today. Also, depending on how rough you feel like being, you can use the chisel just to break the spot weld. I've done that plenty of times in the past, but I'm going to show you the Sawzall method today. I forgot to take this last splash shield out of the way. I'm going to do it now. It just uses the trim tool to pop out 4 little push pins. Okay, we just cut through the 2 spot welds on the driver's side. Luckily, we only have to do 1 on this side because after we break this outer one, we're just going to be able to twist this back and forth until it comes off. So we're just twisting it until that last one breaks. That's it. If it deformed at all during the process, we're going to tap it back into place with the hammer, although I don't think it did. This one did just a little bit. Lastly, we're going to use a grinder to smooth these cut spot welds off. I'm going to hit these with a little bit of paint, and then we're going to go to lunch and let it dry. Okay, so with everything removed and the framework done and the paint dry, now we're ready to start assembling the new bumper. So we're going to start with the steel winch cradle. It bolts to the frame, 8 bolts per side. Out of the hardware kit, you're going to need 8 sets of the larger bolts, the 7/16 bolts, and then all 8 of the smaller, the 3/8 bolts. For the 7/16 bolts, they actually have a different size head for the bolt and the nut. So the bolt uses a 5/8 tool, and the head uses the nut uses an 11/16. With the 3/8 bolts, it's 9/16 tools for the bolt head as well as the nut. So these little spacers that we send make up the difference in thickness for where this piece overlaps the main frame. So that goes on in between. Okay, I didn't mention this earlier, but the larger 4 bolts go in the top 4 holes, and then the smaller bolts use the bottom holes. With this hole on the passenger side, make sure to recapture the washer fluid reservoir tank bracket. Okay, with all the hardware in, we just want to center this thing left to right. You can kind of tell by the slots. And then tighten it down. I'm going to do a couple on each side to keep it uniform. Okay, with the winch cradle all buttoned up, now we're going to put the grill back on. Also, we're not putting in a winch today, but if you did buy one and you're putting it in now, this is the time to do it, this point in the install, because it's really easy to access. You can route your wires really easily, get all the zip ties in. Additionally, that's what these holes are in the back of the winch cradle for, so you can zip tie your winch wires or any other wires for lighting you may have there. Don't forget this one, it's easy to miss. Okay, all we have left at this point is to actually put the bumper on the van. But before we do that, we want to install any accessories we have. In this case, we have just deletes because this van doesn't have the front parking sensors. But we do have the active cruise control sensor, so we're going to go ahead and put that in our bracket. Hopefully you guys can still hear me because a storm just kind of popped up out of nowhere. So you can use a pry bar or something and gently pop this sensor out of the bracket. Just be gentle with it. Then you'll notice the bracket that holds it in place has 2 bolts on the bottom, 1 on the top. We want to make sure and align it just like this. This face of the sensor without the sticker on it is what faces forward. We've got 3/4 20 bolts to hold it in place. I'm going to go back and tighten these down before I install it, but the cover goes over it to sandwich in place, and then the entire assembly bolts in from the inside of the bumper with more of the same hardware. I'm going to go back through and tighten everything down. Okay, I've got my bolts snugged down, and I misspoke just a minute ago. 2 bolts on top, 1 on bottom. Make sure it's oriented like this when you put it in the van. Next, we're going to install the parking sensor deletes. They have a little machined lip on the inside that will help it stay centered in the cutout in the bumper. And then this large fender washer goes on the back side to hold it in place, along with a lock washer and a hex nut. If they spin when you try to tighten them, you'll notice there's a little machined cutout inside the end of the stud for a small hex tool. If you do have the parking sensors, you'll get these housings. These housings will accept the factory Ford parking sensor on the inside. The outside has these 2 long ridges that align with these 2 notches, so you can't install it crooked. It snaps into place. You do that first and then install the sensor from the back side. Make sure to note which direction the sensor was facing, whether the wiring harness was facing outboard or inboard, left or right. The stud on the end of the sensor delete is machined for a 4mm or a 5/32 hex key. That'll keep it from turning while you tighten the nut. All right, with all the little accessories installed in the bumper, we're ready to hang it on the van. A quick side note about the ugly part of this valance. It's not really visible once the bumper's on and adjusted properly, but if it bothers you, now would be the time to either tape it off and paint it black or trim it off totally. The reason we're not trimming it, we haven't done anything on this van that keeps it from being put completely back to stock. So I'm going to leave it just like this. I think it looks just fine. I've got some hardware laid out. If you're doing the install by yourself like I am, it's nice to have some hardware in here. It's nice to have some on the ground. That way you're kind of balancing everything. You can reach in through the air holes on the bumper, or you can reach in from the underside, whichever becomes more convenient. Okay, this part's probably easier with some help, but if you're doing it by yourself, some small tool that'll at least get it snug enough to hold it in place is very handy. I have a backup wrench already on the nut on the back side. I'm going to fish this in there, and I'm actually holding the bumper up to roughly the desired gap with my knees. We'll fine tune it in just a minute. Okay, we'll do the same on the other side. With a couple of these snug down, I'm going to adjust the tilt, and the just general adjustment up and down to make it the same on both sides. We don't want it touching the body at any point, but we do want it pretty close. Also, as far as front to rear adjustment, you don't have to worry about tire clearance. We've incorporated plenty, so just really whatever gap you think looks good. Once I get the adjustment where I like it, I'll go in with some stronger tools and get it snugged down all the way. Okay, I think I like that. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten down all 8 bolts. All right, that should do it. I just torqued down the bolts. I reconnected the wiring harness to the radar sensor, and I zip tied the harness itself to the little holes I pointed out in the back of the winch cradle. To recap, we started by trimming our fender flares, then we removed the fascia, separated the bumper away from it. Then we removed our upper and lower factory crash bar / bumper. Then we installed our winch cradle and our outer shell. We did a final adjustment and torqued down the bolts. Thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at backwoodsAdventureMods.com.